I mentioned, of course, a few weeks ago when I did my review for Martyrs, the original French film, which I like very, very much, spoiler alert, that I wanted to also check out the remake. I bought both movies at the same time, but didn't check them both out at the same time. I decided to watch the original first, as I always do, as I did with Oldboy as well, but with Oldboy, I love the original, it's actually one of my favourite films of all time, but the remake, which a lot of people dislike, I don't dislike. I don't like it as much, nowhere near in fact, but it does do some things which are genuinely different, which I can very much so respect it for. With this movie, I was hoping that that would be the same. Martyrs, in its American remade form, is a movie that squanders what it had to work with. And I usually don't review movies that are bad on this channel, but sometimes I make the exception for pretty much one of two reasons. One is if there's some nugget or seed of brilliance in there, such as the movie called Altitude, which is one of the most horrendous films I've ever seen, but the ending alone is so clever that it's worth a watch just for how good it could have been, to appreciate the concept. Then you have others like this one, or like Son of the Blob, which I didn't even do its own video for, I just reviewed it as part of the original Blob review at the end. I review that one just for the sake of completing the loop. This one is more so in that second camp, because of course I mentioned that I wanted to watch it and review it, so now that I've said that, I kind of had to do so. So I checked it out. It had been about, say, 2 or 3 weeks between watching the original and this one. I've watched the original 3 times. I've watched this one once, and I don't ever plan to watch it again. So why is that the case, and are there any redeeming features? Well, some of the things about the film are very immediately different. For instance, the original has a very washed out bluish grey kind of tone to it, which suits the sombre style. This one, being an American remake, has a much more yellowish and orange kind of tone, which you could say is good looking, but it's so different to the original, but not necessarily in a good way. It feels like it's just different for the sake of it, and it doesn't suit the film, because oranges and yellows are warm colours, and that kind of clashes with what the film's tone is. So I immediately kind of didn't like that much. As far as the rest of the film, well, it didn't help that the characters are also very unlikable compared to the original, and without spoiling anything too specific, regardless of whether or not you've seen the original, the makers of this version completely changed the roles of the characters. They tried to make a certain character into a hero when that was never the point in the original, and it ruins it, because whoever wrote this and whoever made it clearly likes the original but doesn't have a clue what it's on about, because they totally missed the point. It's not just about unlikable characters and having the wrong characters doing the wrong thing to try and make them into a hero, which isn't the point, but you can also see that they didn't really know what they were doing in the case of the villains, because the villains in this movie are so laughably generic. They are almost, and I don't mean this as a joke or a gimmick, they are literally almost Bond-level villains. You expect them to come out stroking a cat with an eye patch. They're ridiculous in comparison to the original. They're just stereotypical bad guys who do things because they're dumb grunts. The person in charge and the second in command are generic and forgettable. In the original, you love to hate the big bad. You love to hate all of the villains in the original, because they're not just villains. They're people who in their own eyes aren't villains. And that's what makes them so good. Whereas in this one, they're clearly villains. They're smirking half the time. That doesn't happen in the original, because that's not the point of the original. This one is such an Americanized remake in all of the worst ways. It's a movie which has no respect for the original. It just tries to emulate it to make a buck and to cash in on the brutal nature and the brutal name that the original made for itself in cult cinema, because it wasn't a massively successful film, and this one certainly should never be, because it doesn't deserve it. Now, I feel sorry for anyone who saw this one before the original, because I feel like it'll probably put you off. If you've seen the original and you're wondering about this one, I would recommend not watching it, because as much as curiosity might get to you, there is quite literally nothing in this movie that makes it worth watching. Absolutely nothing. Now, if you haven't seen the original, still don't watch it. Watch the original, because this movie's trash. Now, it's not trash for somebody who hasn't seen the original, and that's again why I said I feel sorry for people who saw this one first, because if you did, you'll probably have some level of like for this one, or some level of love, and that should not happen. This is no way near the original, and I hate to say that because I want to like remakes, but in the case of this one, it really is a squandered opportunity. You may as well have made it a shot-for-shot remake, and it would have been just as pointless as what they did here. They changed enough to make it kind of justified, but the things which they changed made it worse, not better. So, a big disappointment there. But what about the individual scores? Well, the original, I scored it very highly, of course. This one, not so much. First of all, for the story and plot, I am going to give it a 5, which may sound generous given how I've been wailing on the movie, but the reason why is because as much as I dislike this film, I still have to view it objectively, and viewing it objectively, even though it's not as good as the original, it's still not a awful film in terms of being completely unwatchable. Of course it is watchable for somebody who hasn't seen the original. It's only if you have seen the original that it becomes pointless, but for someone who just walks into it, just tries to watch the movie, I'm sure you could have some fun with it. So giving it a 5 is basically my way of saying it's default. It's not overly good or bad as long as you haven't seen the original. If you've seen the original, it goes down to like a 2 for me personally, but again, I have to be objective. As far as the characters, well, that's an easy subpar 4, because they're not very good. They're not truly horrendous. The characters aren't constantly annoying, for instance. They do some annoying things, but no more than many other horror characters do, so I can't hit on it too hard for that. But they're not great. They're nowhere near the original. As I mentioned in my review of the original movie, one of the characters in particular I believe is Oscar level. There's no Oscar level performance in this movie, not even close. Razzie maybe, but not Oscar. So it's a 4, for sure. As far as the visuals, once again I'm going to be generous and give it a default score of 5. Because, and this is another strike against the movie, not only did they make the characters unlikable, they made the villains ridiculous, but the weirdest thing of all is this movie not only squanders the high concept of the original in terms of how clever it is. I know that's not the definition of high concept, but that's what I mean. But they also squander the brutality. Because if there's one thing that you could justify carrying over, it's how violent the movie is. And surely for an American audience who loves their violence, that's the one thing that you would have made sure to carry over. And they don't. That's the weird thing. So often the camera cuts away from gore, or doesn't show as much blood, or straight up doesn't show gore. There's one scene toward the end, which I'm not going to spoil, but they try to imitate the original, but in a way that just comes off as so pathetic in comparison to the suffering in the original film. It's absolutely ridiculous in comparison. It's almost like a TV special version, made by somebody who read the script of the original but didn't see the film. It's that bad. As far as the audio and soundtrack, well, let's just get it over with. I'm giving it a default 5. Who really cares? It's okay. Music is overly dramatic compared to the original, but that's what you expect with a lot of remakes. And finally, for the rewatchability and entertainment, well, it's a 4. And the only reason why I'm giving it that higher score, which is still, of course, under par, is, as I said earlier, if you haven't seen the original, or maybe you can't stand subtitles, or you just can't get a hold of the original, then sure, check it out, I guess, if you want to watch something, if there's nothing else available. But if you can get your hands on the original, watch that one. It's a no-brainer. So, as a tabulation of all of its scores put together, I am going to definitely give it an under par 2.3 out of 5. And I feel that that's generous. And if I was talking me personally, instead of objective, if I was going to be subjective about it, I think it would probably be closer to something like a 1.8 or a 1.9 out of 5. Because I hated this film. It was trash in every way. It undercut the original in every way. It completely missed the point of what made the original so profound and so good. It's everything that's wrong about remakes, and that's a real shame, because I'm the first person to say that I want to give remakes a chance. But unfortunately on this occasion, you're better off not giving this one a chance. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, if you haven't checked out the review of the original and checked out the original itself, do so, for sure, it's a great film. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.